Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August 1914. There were fervent demonstrations of loyalty and devotion to His Majesty the King as thousands marched through the streets in support of Britain. There was a spontaneous offer to help the motherland, and when the offer of 20,000 troops was accepted, recruits came forward from all parts of the Commonwealth in large numbers, but in no state did they come in greater force than from South Australia. The Australian Naval and Military Expeditionary Force, shown here en route to German New Guinea, were the first infantry to leave Australia in the Great War. When news of the outbreak of World War I was received on the 5th of August 1914, Australian ships at sea, now on a war footing, were ordered to rendezvous in waters south of New Guinea in a bid to seek out and destroy the German Navy's Pacific Squadron. The First World War saw more than 324,000 Australians leave for service overseas, 60,000 of whom, 1 in 5, did not return. The first contingents to leave marched past cheering crowds. Bands played as people sang Auld Lang Syne and God Save the King. Everyone would put on a cheerful face, harbouring but not expressing the fears that all must have felt. Then the train would move off or the ship would steam away from the wharf, and friends and family would be left waving and shouting until their loved ones were out of sight. HMAS Sydney, a 5,400-tonne light cruiser taking water at heavy speed, was recognised as one of the most distinguished Royal Australian Navy warships of the First World War. At the outbreak of the war, the Sydney was one of 4 warships escorting the first convoy of Australian and New Zealand troops that left Albany, Western Australia, for the Middle East on the 1st of November 1914. The heavy protection was due to the threat the SMS Emden posed to the convoy. In the first cruiser duel of the war, Sydney hunted down and destroyed Emden, representing the first ship-to-ship battle and victory for the Royal Australian Navy. Clarence Edwin Pavlich of Port Pirie was a quartermaster on the merchant vessel Glenturret that was requisitioned by the Admiralty during World War I to augment the ships of the Royal Fleet Auxiliary. The German light cruiser Emden had sunk 17 merchant ships, 1 French torpedo boat and 1 Russian cruiser when it stopped and boarded Glenturret in early November 1914 looking for war contraband. The search was cut short when the Emden's crew spotted a torpedo boat it needed to pursue. The Glenturret was allowed to go, and her cargo of shells, gunpowder and dynamite remained undiscovered. Clarence and his shipmates had had a lucky escape. John Patrick Duffy, a barman of 9th Street, Port Pirie, describes his landing on Gallipoli 25th April 1915. "Just a few lines to let you know that I am alive and kicking. I was shot in our first engagement against the Turks. My brigade was the first landing party. We landed between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. When we got within 200 yards of the shore, the Turks opened fire on us, and we had to land the best way we could. Some of the poor chaps never landed. They were shot in the water and were drowned. It was a terrible sight to see our comrades dying alongside of us, and yet we could not help them." Private John Patrick Duffy, service number 725, 10th Infantry Battalion, was killed instantly by a shell on the 13th of December 1916 in Goudecourt, France. Following the landing at Anzac Cove by the Anzacs on the 25th of April 1915, the beach became the main base for the Australian and New Zealand troops for the 8 months of the Gallipoli campaign. The 600 metres long cove shows ships, troops and cargo on the beachfront. A sniper using a rifle with a periscopic sight while an observer checks the results with a trench periscope. On Gallipoli, periscopes provided a less dangerous way of observing the Turks from the trenches. Looking over the parapet at Quinn's Post, for example, was extremely hazardous as the enemy line was less than 50 metres away. The periscope rifle was invented in May 1915 by Lance Corporal William Beach, 2nd Battalion, and builder's foreman prior to enlistment. This device allowed a soldier standing in a trench to take accurate aim and fire without exposing himself to the enemy. Before the war, lead and zinc concentrates excess to smelter demand was shipped to Germany and Belgium for treatment. Australia then imported considerable quantities of manufactured lead from Germany. At the outbreak of war, lead and zinc shipments were considered war contraband and ceased being exported to prevent it falling into enemy hands. Only British government purchases of Australian commodities prevented a major economic collapse. Lead output from Port Pirie purchased by the British government was dispatched to Russia and Britain for conversion into munitions. A flat-bottomed barge transporting wounded soldiers from Anzac Cove. 55 South Australians were killed in the first 24 hours on Gallipoli, with hundreds of wounded transported to hospitals first at Lemnos, Greece, and then Alexandria, Egypt. There were a total number of 26,111 Australian casualties, including 8,709 Australian deaths. This included 27 men from Port Pirie. Despite this, it has been said that Gallipoli had no influence on the course of the war. Two brothers are honoured in the Port Pirie Cemetery, but their bones lie under foreign skies. Private Roland Rowe, Regimental Number 1209, 16th Infantry Battalion, paid the supreme sacrifice on the 2nd of May 1915 at Gallipoli. Roland enlisted in Port Pirie and was a prominent footballer at Kalunga. He celebrated his 24th birthday in Egypt and was of a quiet disposition and highly respected. Roland has no known grave, known unto God, and is commemorated on the Lone Pine Memorial to the missing at Gallipoli. Private Frank Thomas Rowe, Regimental Number 4332, 48th Infantry Battalion, died of multiple gunshot wounds in France on the 10th of August 1916, aged 38. He left a widow, Elizabeth Emma Rowe, and 8 young children. He is buried in France. The war obliterated the distinction between civilian and military targets. There was massive destruction of civilian property, including houses, factories and fields. Sometimes even whole towns were obliterated. 9 villages on a ridge in eastern France were destroyed in a single day. The catastrophic results for civilians who were innocent bystanders included shortages, famine and displacement. Data from different countries suggest that at least 10 million people were displaced either internally or as a result of fleeing across an international frontier. Private Fred Lethbridge, Service Number 3201, 27th Battalion, was wounded in action in France on the 8th of August 1916, with a gunshot wound to his right shoulder and shrapnel wound to his back. It was later discovered that he had a 1-inch piece of shrapnel embedded in a lung, which he carried throughout his life until his death in Port Pirie in 1970. During World War II, he held a commission as lieutenant in the 6th Battalion Volunteers, enlisting on the 10th of April 1942. Captain George Day of the 27th Battalion was wounded in action, displayed great dash and courage during the assault, and after having his right hand blown off, he continued to lead his men and direct operations until the position was captured. George received a Military Cross recommendation from his 7th Infantry Brigade, as well as a recommendation for a Foreign Award, which he eventually received in September 1920, the Italian Silver Medal and Diploma for Military Valour. An estimated 1,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people served with the Australian Imperial Force in World War I. It is difficult to establish exact numbers because the enlistment process did not record a person's ethnicity. The Defence Act 1909 prevented people from enlisting if they were not substantially of European origin or descent. During World War I, this law was supposed to be enforced by medical officers, but they did not always abide by the ruling, especially as the war continued and more troops were needed. Larice was born in Port Pirie, South Australia, on the 2nd of March 1898. Private Larice John Inglis, Service Number 2835, 12th Infantry Battalion, was killed in action at Belgium on the 5th of October 1917, aged 19 years. His body was never recovered. He is honoured on the Meningate Memorial in Belgium, alongside another 6,000 Australians who also have no known grave, known unto God. Thousands of Australian nurses were sent to various Commonwealth nations during the First World War, including over 500 sent to India. Genevieve Julia Amy, who lived at Butler's Bridge, east of Lower Broughton, had been trained as a nurse at the Port Pirie Public Hospital for 3 years. She embarked from Melbourne on the 6th of March 1918 per SS Ormonde and was posted as a staff nurse in Bombay. Lady Bridges opened the Women's Soldiers Memorial in Port Pirie on the 14th of October 1924 by stating, "You women of Port Pirie, I appreciate the great honour you have bestowed upon me in asking me to unveil your memorial. Some of you have had great privilege of knowing these men, these gallant men, who fought with such courage and who gave their lives, and it is again your privilege to have possession of their memory, a possession which no one can take from you. All you can do now is to show that fine spirit of courage, devotion and self-sacrifice that they showed." Men of the South Australia's 3rd Light Horse Regiment posing for official war photographer Frank Hurley. The man kneeling is Sergeant Clarence Garland Plenty, born in Napperby. Clarence was farming when, at age 24, he joined. 2 weeks after war was declared on the 4th of August 1914. Clarence had spent 7 years' service with the 17th Light Horse and was serving with the 24th Light Horse when war broke out. Clarence saw action at Gallipoli and Palestine. Clarence returned to Australia on the 13th of February 1919 after 4.5 years. The children of the Napperby Public School formed a guard of honour and sang "My Native Land", and Clarence was presented with a massive gold Albert chain. Clarence was accidentally killed on the 28th of September 1970, aged 80 years, and is buried in the Port Pirie Cemetery. The first day to be called Anzac Day was the 13th of October 1915 and occurred in Adelaide as a replacement for the 8-hour day holiday, a forerunner of Labor Day and already a public holiday. This event was more of a patriotic carnival designed to raise awareness of and funds for the war effort than the solemn commemoration it was to become. Anzac Day, as we know it, was first observed on 25th of April 1916 as people came together to honour those lost at Gallipoli. In Australia, some state governments organised events to commemorate the occasion, but the Commonwealth, other than naming the day as Anzac Day, did not. By the late 1920s, Anzac Day was a public holiday in every state and territory. Andreas Voitkin, a Latvian-born Russian, migrated to Australia in 1913. He found employment in the Port Pirie smelter and enlisted on the 14th of October 1915, leaving his Latvian-born wife Emily and 5 children at their Agnes Street address in Port Pirie. Private Andreas Voitkin, sitting left, service number 2134 32nd Infantry Battalion, was wounded by shrapnel in the right leg and left arm and taken prisoner by the Germans in July 1916. 26 men from Port Pirie became prisoners of war during World War I. Australian soldiers lying out in the open at an overcrowded first aid post in 1918 having been gassed at Villers-Bretonneux. William Patrick Hogan, a well-known lightweight boxer in pugilistic circles who used to fight in Olympia Hall in Port Pirie, was gassed at Villers-Bretonneux. Sergeant William Patrick Hogan, service number 90, 43rd Infantry Battalion, was also awarded the Military Medal for coolness and courage under fire. In 1918, 1 of every 4 shells fired on the Western Front contained poison gas. The proprietary football club perhaps put up a record for the Commonwealth in regard to volunteering by its active members. No fewer than 13 players of the past season prior to the outbreak of war left to join the Australian Expeditionary Forces, to say nothing of the number of honorary members. Of the 13 players who left, 6 were winners of gold medals for brilliancy in some department of the game. Recruitment posters were often used in Australia to enlist sportsmen into the Australian Imperial Force. The campaign to enlist sportsmen was fueled by a strong belief that by playing sport, young men developed specific skills and qualities that could be used on the battlefield. Everything that science could devise was flung into flight. Observation balloons scoured the enemy terrain, keeping their ground batteries informed of hostile gun positions and troop concentrations. Observers provided real-time information through telephone and telegraph wiring. They were so effective that early air forces made enemy balloons a target priority. Soldiers on the Western Front during the 1916-1917 winter endured the most severe conditions in 40 years. the open and exposed trenches provided no protection from the bitter cold and the biting blasts of icy air which swept the trenches, which were more dreaded than the shrapnel of the enemy and sometimes more deadly. In November 1914, an urgent appeal to South Australians was made to provide sheepskin waistcoats each to the men in the trenches. Comfort gifts like sheepskin vests, mittens, socks, balaclavas and scarves would have saved many diggers' lives from temperatures that dropped to minus 20 degrees. The most merciless enemy was the foul mud and stink of rotten corpses. Troops endured insect and rodent-infested trenches that turned into squalid mud baths during the European winter 1916-1917. Temperatures on the Somme could drop to minus 20 degrees Celsius, and soldiers suffered from frostbite and trench foot, losing fingers, toes, and in the worst cases, their feet. Shipped from Australia for service, horses numbered more than 120,000. Of these, 82,000 went to India, while another 10,000 went to France, with the remainder forming part of the Australian light horse units who fought in the Middle East. That the horses were unable to return with the men they fought alongside was no doubt heartbreaking for many, but the decision to leave them behind was entirely due to prohibitive costs and the threat of disease that their transportation home would have incurred. The Imperial Camel Corps Brigade was formed in 1916 from British and Commonwealth troops and was attached to the Anzac Mounted Division. Private Vincent Walter Holthouse of Solomontown, Port Pirie, was detailed from the 9th Light Horse Regiment to the Imperial Camel Corps on the 9th of September 1916. They fought in several battles and engagements in the Senussi Campaign, the Sinai, the Palestine Campaign and the Arab Revolt. The brigade suffered 246 men killed. The ICC was disbanded in May 1919 after the end of the war. The Lady Galway Clubhouse for convalescent soldiers at Henley Beach was opened in 1916 after the work performed by the charity outgrew the ballroom at Government House. Funds raised by members of the Port Pirie community were used to complete the building and to provide many of the comforts it offered servicemen, hence the dedicated Port Pirie wing. The Cheer Up Society was a South Australian patriotic organisation founded during the Great War in Adelaide in November 1914, whose aims were provision of refreshments, entertainment and creature comforts for soldiers in South Australia. In mid-July 1915, a well-attended meeting was held with the object of forming a branch of the Cheer Up Society in Port Pirie with the aim of working for soldiers in every way. It was thought that because Port Pirie held the country record in South Australia for recruiting for the Great War, that a hearty response from residents in providing newspapers, cigarettes, scarves, socks and other necessities would be forthcoming. Albert Alfred Burt Davies was schooled in Warnertown, South Australia, enlisting on the 25th of August 1915 with the 12th Reinforcements 3rd Light Horse Regiment, having had 3 years' experience as a member of the Warnertown Defence Rifle Club. He was of a modest and genial disposition and employed as a stamper living in Solomontown, where he was probably employed at Forgan's Foundry. On the 20th of April 1917, Burt received gunshot wounds to both legs at Abu Sitta during the Second Battle of Gaza and died of wounds due to septicemia on the 25th of April 1917. Port Pirie can claim to have established the first Fathers of Sailors and Soldiers Association in the state. The president, Mr. Charles Edwards, stated that its objects were to watch over and forward in any way the interests of all sailors, soldiers and nurses who were on active service outside Australia. They formed reception committees for returning sailors, soldiers and nurses. The group actively involved themselves in bringing before the authorities the legitimate rights and demands regarding settlement of returned men on the land. Also, to assist in deserving cases, to secure for returned men reinstatement to positions held by them prior to enlistment, and to assist returned men by way of preference in obtaining employment. A hospital visitation committee was appointed to visit returned men who might be in the institution and supply them with comforts. The Australian Comforts Fund was established in August 1916 to coordinate the activities of the state-based patriotic funds, which were established earlier in World War I. Mainly run by women, they provided and distributed free comforts to the Australian fit fighting men in all the battle zones. Volunteers served over 12 million cups of tea and coffee to the First World War troops. in tents, dugouts and hastily assembled huts at the corner of every Australian battlefield. The Australian Comforts Fund stalls served mugs of tea and coffee to exhausted troops trudging in and out of the front line. The Red Cross Society in Port Pirie provided cholera belts, socks, scarves, handkerchiefs, shirts, caps, fly nets, tinned milk, cigarettes, boiled lollies, chocolates and other articles. The Battle of the Hindenburg Line, which began on the 18th of September 1918, was a key turning point in the 100 Days Offensive that eventually led to the end of the Great War. With just 8 tanks available to the Australian Corps, Lieutenant General Sir John Monash ordered the pioneers to construct dummy tanks, which when put in positions on the horizon just before dawn on the day of the attack, their menacing silhouettes would confront and demoralise the German troops. Of the 12,000 prisoners and 100 guns captured that day, the Australians took 76 guns and 4,300 prisoners. After more than 4 years of hardship, courage and sacrifice, the fighting on the Western Front came to an end on the 11th of November 1918. The Allied forces, strengthened by the entry of the United States into the war a year and a half earlier, were finally able to force Germany to surrender. The armistice, an end to hostilities, was signed by Britain, France and Germany, with Britain signing on behalf of the Empire as a whole. This effectively ended the war and prompted spontaneous celebrations among the troops and throughout the British Empire. Following prolonged peace negotiations, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June 1919. The treaty included a commitment to establish a League of Nations to safeguard the peace. Christianity in Australia, Europe and the United States served to unite fellow soldiers of the same denomination and motivated them to fight. Many understood the call to war as a call to sacrifice, believing that the laying down of their lives could make the world a better place. The men who fought in World War I were products of the Victorian age. They would all have gone to Sunday school. Their outlook was informed by Christianity. 36 men from the Presbyterian Church in Port Pirie answered the call for God and empire. 7 made the supreme sacrifice. Campaign medals of the British Empire were awarded to officers and men of British and Imperial forces who served in any theatre of the First World War against the Central European powers during 1914 and 15. Many public ceremonies were held in Port Pirie from June 1920 onwards to decorate members of the Australian Infantry Force who enlisted for active service. Medals were also handed to dependents of soldiers who had lost their lives. In that connection, the most pathetic was in the case of the late Private Arthur Thorne, service number 2238 27th Battalion, killed in action, Villers-Bretonneux, France, whose bright little son was handed the medal during the ceremony at Port Pirie Institute. He was escorted onto the stage by his grandfather. When the Great War broke out, the population of Port Pirie, South Australia was approximately 10,000 people. 2,571 men enlisted from Port Pirie. Of those who left our shores, more than 240 were killed in action. There were a further 972 wounded. 1,212, or just under half of enlisted men, were either killed or wounded. There were an untold number of men who returned to Australia wounded mentally. Honours gained by Port Pirie men: Military Crosses, 13. Distinguished Conduct Medals, 17. Military Medals, 74. Meritorious Service Medals, 8. Mentioned in dispatches, 96. Italian Silver Medal, 1. That represented a total of 208 decorations, or 8% of enlistments. There were many men who were born in Port Pirie and killed in action who are not listed on this Roll of Honour. More than 295,000 Australians served on the Western Front between March 1916 and November 1918. During those 33 months, more than 30 battles were fought, including Fromelles, the Somme, Bullecourt, Marcinges, Passchendaele and Villers-Bretonneux. Australia's losses on the Western Front were staggering, with more casualties in the first 6 weeks of our involvement than the entire 8-month Gallipoli campaign. By the end of 1918, 46,000 Australians had lost their lives and 132,000 were wounded. Memorial Oval, Port Pirie, remembering the fallen during the COVID-19 pandemic. In January 1919, during the Spanish flu epidemic, an inhalatorium was established in the northeast corner of Soldiers Memorial Park, fronting Gertrude Street, where the public were invited to submit themselves for treatment in the form of pressurised steam carrying sulphate of zinc solution. Once breathed in, it was thought that the steam solution would disinfect the person's throats and air passages. Australia suffered 13,000 deaths from the Spanish influenza. The toll was low, almost negligible compared with the great cost to the nation of the staggering casualty rates from the battlefields in Western Europe during the Great War. In 1919, the Pirie Returned Soldiers Association held an office on Ellen Street. However, it had no attractions and no one went there except on business. The memorial grandstand, of which a club room was included, was built and opened on the 13th of August 1927. This was the first of 4 RSL club rooms to be premises for the sub-branch. On the 31st of May 1936, a new club quarters were opened by State Commandant Brigadier Martin. The premises, formerly in the occupation of the Union Bank Australasia, formed the northern section of the lower floor of the town hall and was leased by the town council to the RSL for peppercorn rental at £1.1 per year. A third club room opened on 42 Mary Ellis Street on the 15th of September 1956. In 1994, the club moved to its current premises on 294 The Terrace. Oliver Holmes Woodward was born in Tenterfield, New South Wales, served with the 1st Tunnelling Company and was awarded a Military Cross and 2 bars, effectively 3 military crosses. On his return from the Great War, Oliver Woodward went on to become the manager of the Broken Hill Associated Smelter in Port Pirie. Woodward Park was developed by Broken Hill Associated Smelters in 1935 and was named in his honour as a tribute to his outstanding war service. We recognise the red poppy as the commemorative flower of remembrance. The flower reminds us of those who lost their lives or suffered in wars, conflicts, and peacekeeping operations. It's a tradition that began in the early 1900s after World War I. The Poppies Project was a simple tribute of love and honour that sparked a massive community outpouring in Port Pirie and district in the centenary of Armistice Year. An estimated 2,500 plus poppies were knitted and crocheted for the Port Pirie RSL, with contributors from children right through to the aged and from many different backgrounds and cultures. Individually tied onto a camouflage net, the poppies adorn the outside of the Port Pirie Military Museum in a spectacular tribute for the duration of the centenary of World War I commemorations. This Anzac Day, at the going down of the sun and in the morning, we shall remember them, lest we forget.